Hello, aspirants. I hope all of you must have written the examination quite well. In this short session, we are going to look at the analysis, of yesterday's English question paper. Okay, so it's going to be a very short one. We will try to do these questions we were able to remember, with some of our students and I myself, around 60 questions from UGC net. We will see to that how these questions could have been answered and how I myself did and some of our students have attempted. Most of the questions are indirect. We have studied, we discussed. Most of these are available in our YouTube channel videos, short videos, terminologies, and even the PDFs which we shared, and of course in book. Only thing is that analytical ability assessment and the this doing the intelligence guesswork would have required. So keeping that in mind, let's look at some of these questions. Yeah, so you can see that, right? So there was a question on GB Shaw's Pygmalion, right? Just last week we completed the work. Pygmalion, the very title is taken from, the which, I guess, I remember that it was Roman, Greek, or which, the myth. Okay, it was, I think, the Greek myth. Same way, there was a question on E.M. Foster's novel. Yeah, I think the class of East and West, and particularly in which novel it is very less. Okay, if you look at E.M. Foster's novel, like what is that famous Indian novel, The Passage to India, or the novel which has setting of Italian setting, there was a clash. But Howard's End was the one novel where exactly there is no clash. I think that answer we should have selected. Another question was on Charles Dickens. The which novel opens with a fog. If you look at the novel, it was Hard Times. Okay, I think one of the novel which was given there, when the very, because the other novels were not set in London. Okay, so that was very easy one if you know the very basic plot outline. There was a question from Shakespeare's line and chronology. Yeah, on match the following, right? Some lines from poetry, and there was one line, and they asked from which poet, this which work. And I think, though we might not remember, but we could have guessed that this line was from Shakespeare's Othello. Okay, we have a importance of candlelight in Shakespeare's Othello, please remember. Okay. So then there was a question on Bacon, the peculiar essayist, compared to Charles Lamb and Hazlitt. We know that, okay, compared to Hazlitt and Charles Lamb, Bacon was a peculiar essayist in that sense. We can do the assertion and reasoning one. And there was a arranging the chronology of that important lines of the first para from Bacon's essay of studies, which we studied. And you know that, okay, different usage of studies, why studies are required, and what are the individual subject they teach us. So if you see the chronology of the essay, very easily you could have done that. There was another question on Bacon and Cowley's work, chronology, match the following, and one or two work. If you are able to do that, we could have done that question. And the very famous question, another chronology question, right? They ask us to arrange in correct chronology, Utopia, Religo Medici, and other work, right? We know that Religo Medici, written by the author, and Utopia, written by whom. And I think all the options were comparatively easier except one, right? Then there was a question on Thomas Hardy's chronology, right? And that also we could have done. There was a question on from chronology questions were on Test of the D'Iberville, Far from the Madding, I think, what was that? Trumpet Major, Return of the Native, and there was a one minor novel also, right? So if you had gone through that chronology, overall, all the the famous 8 tragedy, etc. We know that, okay, it was a kind of a tragic one. The other options cannot come under that, right? And there was a question on Arnold's poetry, role of a poetry, right? Very famous one, the purpose of poetry. We know that, how it teaches us, the very purpose, the very famous line from Study of Poetry. Okay, so that is a very easily we could have done. There was a match the following in which we have to match, link the poem with the characteristics. And if you had known one this question on Wordsworth Tintern Abbey, it's a topological poem because it Wordsworth describes the topography. the physical description of the landscape, right? We remember that, no, how it describes the why and the whole landscape. So it could have easily we could have done, right? And next one, there was a question on Coleridge when he described the year 1832. Yeah, though later we realized the importance of 1832, why he called the three silent revolution which took place in 1832, right? And we discussed so many times the political social backdrop. Okay, 1832, what happened? The first reform bill happened. That's why indirectly it describes that 1832 three important things. Yeah, there was a shift in society and literature. The first one was, how different professions were separated from church. Okay, so that was the first one. Second one was literature diverged from other profession, right? Literature became serious profession compared to the previous one. And the third one, when the prose press, the newspaper broke away from established literature and other things, all other propaganda of the time. And we know that reform bills, okay, if you remember the reform bill, you know that all these, paved the way for the social changes. Okay, so if we understood the age, we could have done the question. Then there was a chronology questions on these important work, right? I remember the two one, right? We remember that very famous, the campus novel Lucky Jim. Sometime in 1950s it was written, and after 10 years around, I think one of the famous novel. I think just last week we completed this work, The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, and I guess around 1961. Okay, and if you look at the other two options, slight chronology of these two work could have helped you to arrive at the correct answer. Samuel Beckett, we did leave in last week, right? When multiple times this question was asked, right? Which was the trilogy? Molly, Malone Dies, and Unmanageable were the tragedy, right? There was a Murphy also, I think, remember that option, but Murphy was a separate novel which was written almost a decade earlier, right? Killiard School, there was a question. Killiard School, we studied in literary movement and terminologies, right? Just last week we had a class, right? You know that Scottish writers of 19th century, for example, like James Barrie and others, right? So that was about the Killiard School. And there was a poem, match the following and matching the chronology of the poem, right? We could have guessed one or two, right? If you remember, that also we could have done, right? Then Indian writing in English, R.K. Narayan's work, right? They've given the work of, some of the very famous novels of R.K. Narayan and ask us to ask question on that. Indian writing in literature, we studied that. Same way Mulk Raj Anand, right? They describe characters like Mulk Raj Anand, so untouchable. There was definitely a wrong question on, untouchable and, Bhakha, right? They have alluded that to a different novel. I think very easily that we could have done. Jayant Mahapatra, we know that he's a Orissa, poet from Orissa. Very easily we could have done. Anita Desai's work, which in which the protagonist leaves, the woman, the wife, that it's from the where shall I go this summer, from that work. If you know the other novels of the basic outline, you know that the plot outline. Okay, they're not they've explained in detail. So very easily you could have done that question also. A.K. Ramanujan, match the following religious background from where he comes from, right? He's a Tamilian, we know that, okay? A.K. Ramanujan, so that was also an easier question. Nissim Ezekiel, we all know that Nissim Ezekiel is a Jewish poet, okay? He was from a Jew, okay? So that background, so Indian poet, that also match the following we could have done. Sharan Kumar Limbel, we discussed multiple time, right? Very important writer, okay? Dalit writer, okay? So if you remember the aesthetics of Dalit writing, very easily you can arrive at what he could have meant by Satyam, Sivam, and Sundaram. Right? If you read those options, assertion, and reasoning, we can arrive at the question very easily. Then there was a question on Canadian writers and their work, match the following, which also, if you remember the names, as it insisted, in every exam there used to be lot more chronology questions, but in this exam there was less. Next one, G.B. Shaw's Arms and Man, right? A basic question from Arms and Man, that also you could have done. Harold Pinter's birthday party, right? Question the section title name, okay, from birthday party, right? That also we had recently. William Congreve's Way of the World, very easily. I think the question was on relationship, right? Okay, right? And we know that, okay, the relationship Mrs. Marwood had with Mr. Fainall, or Mirabelle had with with Mirabelle, Millabelle. or Witwoud, what kind of a pursuance, the wooing they did. So very easily this question could have been done. Right? This is a very famous question, Hayavadana by Girish Karnad's work. We know that it is borrowed from Thomas Mann, but basically it comes from the Indian epic. Okay, so that option you could have selected. Chaucer's work, right? Chaucer's work on Pilgrim's Progress, Pilgrim, that is Canterbury Tales, okay, and all other works they have given a short description of that. Even the line was on Legend of Good Women also. So very easily you could have arrived at the answer if you know the basic plot of that. There was a question on J.S. Mill's quote. Okay, J.S. Mills was a political philosopher who lived in 19th century. I mean, if we had known the political social backdrop, we could have arrived at a question also. As far as criticism is concerned, we know that very famous question, okay, identifying different archetypes with the season, right? Alan Shawalter's three stage, right? Multiple times we discussed the feminine, feminist, and female stage, in which the different stage. One stage they copied, second they resisted, and third they created their own mouth, own perspective. I.A. Richards, what was that? What could have been the title of practical criticism? And if you had, even if you don't remember, we could have guessed it by those four title, and all the four were on textual, all the three. One was on emotions, and we know that we have to remove that. Which post-modern critic, deconstructionist critic, was very notorious? Okay, there was Foucault's name was not there, right? Then we could have selected Foucault, but Lyotard and Derrida was there, and I think Lyotard and Derrida, if we compare, the answer should be on Derrida, the most controversial postmodern or deconstructionist critic, right? Same way, there was a definition of deconstruction and postmodernism, right? And we know the theories, right? We discussed in detail, so very easily we could have arrived. There was a question on Roland Barthes, right? Death of the author, assertion and reasoning question. That also we could have done easily. Dollymore and Sinfield's cultural materialism. Yeah, what are the characteristics? This is the very typical one, right? Historical context, political commitment, and other. And there was a transcendental or something was there. That was not the option. Tori Moy, her work, right? Sexual and textual politics, something was there, right? We could have guessed with those feminist work what she could have written, right? Cultural as a complex word, right? And we discussed that also. We know that Raymond Williams called culture is one of the most complicated and complex word. Television and culture on culture studies, assessment and reasoning, how television shapes our ideology. That was John, Fisk's question was there. Ania Lumba, right, a colonial, post-colonial writer, okay, on her book from post-colonial and post-colonial critic, right, post-colonial perspective. This question was there, but this was somewhat, we were not able to identify. Psychoanalysis and symbolism, right? There was a question on Freud's ego and id ego and that perspective. The question, right? We already discussed, the difference between id ego and superego and conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. So very easily you could have done that. Freudian symbol, right? Pond as unique symbol, flower as yoic, lance as a phallic, and tower as a sexual pleasure. All this that comparison, right? And when we discuss that, you can have gone for what kind of a symbol that represent. John Burgess, overall the concept of gaze, okay, the postmodern gaze, the perspective of how, in postmodern literature, how the perspective is developed, okay. Yeah, so that question of, different kind of a perspective or ideology, so gaze in that sense, okay, like male gaze or colonial gaze or, subdued and other different types of gazes, okay. Pierre Bourdieu's work Habitus, very easily. If you have done this, match the following one word very easily, the other, could have been done. Right? Remember that the questions were the match the following, two match the following. If you are able to do, the other two, very easily we could do. They did not make it very difficult in that sense, right? There was a very famous quotation from Virginia Woolf. Okay, if you read this line, we can say, why did men drink wine and women drink water? Why was one sex so prosperous? When you think of prosperous, because material feminism, yeah. Though we might not remember that this line is from which author, but we can guess it who could have spoken. Because 1960s and 70s, the other feminist writers who were mentioned in the book, by the time, most of the Western women were economically they were liberated, okay? But during Virginia Woolf's time, they were not liberated. Okay, that's why she say the room of one's own. Women need money. Women need privacy. So we could guess that this line must have been told by her. Then there was another one on post-colonial writer, Three Women's Text, written by Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak. I think if you had done this match the following question, you could have done all the question. Right, and there was another question on different writers who wrote male characters. Yeah, Charlotte Bronte, Jane Austen, or Virginia Woolf. Right. So in that also very easiest question. Linguistic and language studies, there were questions on phonology, morphology, semantics, and syntax. I think all of us must have done that. Very easy questions, right? We had long sessions on that. Our ma'am must have taught all that. Ferdinand de Saussure's, signifier and the signified, right? So many times we discussed. So it was also a very easy question, right? We know that the relationship between the signifier and signified is arbitrary, but still Saussure believed that there is a kind of a link, okay, which post-structuralists like Derrida and others break that. They create the wedge, okay. So that is the core one. Articulation system, phonetics, yeah, the organs of speech and sound production, yeah, what kind of a, the sound and the, the organ and its process. The question was on that. Vocal cords and syllable, opening of vocal cord, number of syllable, that type of a question. Then there was a general communication question. I think it might have been from paper one also, right? Different Shannon and Weaver Laswell model, right? Then research methods in English. They asked MLA 9's in-text citation, how to cite multiple author, different parts of a thesis, okay, organizing in correct order, right? So we know that we discussed and in PPTs provided, basic answers are given. So these were also very easy questions, right? And there was a question on matching, match the following. We know that South Ganga is the repository of dissertation, right? Project Muse was a humanities and social science journals, one. And World Cat, the very words cat suggests catalog. Okay, I think all of you must have done match the following correctly, right? Then there was a question, on archetypes, myth criticism. Yeah, what are these symbol and what they represent? Sea, river, sun, serpent, etc. And which one is not a dystopian one? All the other novel, I think George Orwell's novel was there. So we can say Pride and Prejudice is a not a dystopian novel. Okay, so these are the around 63 questions we were able to remember. So I think comparatively, as I told you in that short video, overall uh, exam was moderate to difficult. Okay, unlike June 2026 25th exam, which was more complicated and lot of unnecessary and irrelevant questions were asked. So it was very easy, right? In that sense, if you had studied. So kindly do the analysis, wait for the keys, download and check and keep your fingers crossed. All the best. Thank you.